Thank you so much, Mark, for sitting with me here today.
My pleasure.
Talk about a few things that I'm sure you're so knowledgeable about. Gaza, specifically your time in Gaza, what it was like returning from Gaza, and perhaps, if we have some time, your views on the American medical establishment in relation to Palestinian solidarity. So perhaps we can start off by asking how you first got into humanitarian work as a doctor.
During my hand surgery fellowship in Miami, University of Miami, it serves a Latin basin, and I had noticed a large number of children that were coming in with birth defects. And then I spoke to a family once, and she told me that Ecuador, where they were from, had a ton of birth defects, way more than I would see in the United States, probably from colonial times and consanguineous marriages that were induced upon the population, such that you could almost tell what region of Ecuador somebody's from by what birth defect they have. And many of them were cleft lips and palates, but thousands were club feet and club hands, very deformed hands and feet. And so I made arrangements to go to Guayaquil, Ecuador first, but 30 times later I was in Loja and many other towns in Ecuador, Cuenca. And so it became a passion of mine to go to Ecuador several times a year. And my ex-wife, whose heart is big as a soccer ball, even started an adoption agency for Mexican adoptions. And we ended up adopting a child from Mexico together, who's my youngest child. And so overseas mission work hasn't stopped for me. I routinely go to Honduras now.
Okay. So when it came to going to Gaza earlier this year, what went into that decision?
Well, I didn't just go to do elective surgery in Gaza. I've always been drawn to national disaster areas as well, any place where I know that I could be of help, because going to these, for elective surgical missions, I know what an austere environment is. And I also, particularly for St. Pedro Sula, Honduras, the pre-Ukraine war murder capital of the world, there's a tremendous lack of medical supplies and expertise and training that's catered towards the poor. The rich in every part of the world, as you know, have all the medical care they need, but 3/5 of the world will never see a doctor or a nurse their entire life. It's an amazing number of beating hearts and souls in our world that will never get even remote access to medical care. And so when 9/11 happened, I was at ground zero on 9/11. When the earthquake hit Haiti, I was in care for outside of Port-au-Prince, through Port-au-Prince, now at a hospital that needed help. The day the earthquake hit, when Katrina hit, I was on the tarmac triaging patients the day the earthquake hit land. So those are the type of events that have always attracted me, and I've always found that you were helpful at, So when Gaza came, I was running a telehealth service for mostly the Latin basin, where doctors that I'm helping advance their skills would send me photographs of a planned hand incision. As you know, I do mostly hand surgery. They would plan an incision for a birth defect on a hand, and I would say, I would make the incisions this way. Or, they would send me x-rays, and I would give telehealth advice, and sometimes even videos in real time in the middle of the night of a surgery that's taking place, for a trauma surgery. And I started getting images from Gaza based on an invitation from a friend of mine. And early on, the x-rays were fine. What would you do here? What would you do here? You're doing a great job. Then the quality of the pictures started to deteriorate dramatically and rapidly. Not the quality of the actual, in terms of pixels or exposure, the quality of the work that was being done was rather elementary. And so I finally returned a text and challenged them at the risk of offending the doc and say, this is not satisfactory. Can I ask you what level of training you have? Thinking this guy's going to be offended, or a guy or girl's going to be offended. And as it turns out, the response was, I'm not an orthopedic surgeon. I'm a medical student. And we have a resident with us that did most of the work. What happened to the attendings, meaning the senior doctors? They were all killed in a bomb blast, was the answer. So with that, I contacted a friend who got me in touch with a couple of agencies. PAMA is who I called first. They said, I'm sorry, but there's no space. All of our planned missions have an orthopedic surgeon attached to them already. 2 or 3 days later, I got a call back saying that he backed out of the mission. Would you like to go? And so within a week, I was ready to go. And I'm already packed. I'm packed right now for another mission. I'm always packed. And I had 700 pounds of orthopedic supplies in 4 huge oversized bags, always ready to go. And I left with 700 pounds and surgical trays with instruments and metallic implants that I need to do what I do, drills, everything. So, and I always donate them wherever I go and leave them behind and bring back the empty suitcases. So anyway, so I got there with 700 pounds. I got on airplanes and stood standby. It took a day and a half flying standby to get to Cairo. I ended up getting a plane through Frankfurt to Cairo, and I landed in Cairo and got to the hotel, which was attached to the airport, an hour before the vans were leaving to go through the Sinai on the way to Rafah. So the timing was tight, but it was perfect.
I mean, we've heard so much, of course, about the blockade that's still there on Gaza. So I'm wondering,
it's horrible.
Yes, I'm wondering if you could maybe expound on what it was like actually getting into Gaza.
Well, first of all, the 15-hour ride to get through the Sinai was impressive, right? It's the only thing that you see almost the whole way is a wall that's keeping people from people. I was told it was just to keep the Bedouins out. But when we got to the Egyptian border, 5 hours there to get clearance to come through was arduous and fatiguing by itself, because we got there. I was beyond exhausted getting there. You couldn't sleep on the ride in because of the quality of the drivers and the complete ignorance of this thing called painted lines on a highway, and so it was. But when we got to Egypt, they almost didn't let our supplies through because of the lack of paperwork, even though we had clearance from the World Health Organization to bring our supplies in. But the Rafah crossing was interesting. The most standout feature of it was me knowing, because I was being schooled on the way there, that Rafah itself, a strip of land the size of Philadelphia, needs 700 trucks a day to keep it alive. And we get to the Rafah crossing, and as soon as we get through customs, still on the Egypt side, before we get on a separate set of buses to go into Gaza, we see 700 trucks. We think, oh my gosh, that's great. They're still getting their 700, supplies. These are going to go in today. But the trucks never crossed, So to pursuant to your question, what was my feeling like? To put it in perspective, I'll answer it when we left, when the Rafah crossing was still open, and it was open the whole time we were there. There weren't 2 lines of trucks for a couple miles long, side to side, bumper to bumper. Now there were 8 rows of trucks, side to side, hardly enough space to walk in between, literally inches between the bumpers, for 30 miles long, right? That's almost 300 miles of truck, still waiting to get in, with food supplies rotting on the back, loaded with potatoes, dead chickens, water tankers, medical supplies, and these trucks did not have obscured names shrunk wrap on the back of them. Oxfam, World Central Kitchen, Save the Children, UNHCR, every, the Turkish Red Cross or Green Crescent. There was food supplies from every Arabic country that was there with their name on it. tons and tons of food and medical supplies. There were clearly medical supplies there, none of which got in. And we know that because the 700 pounds of supplies that I alone took in were gone before the first week, right? Consumed. Dr. Sidwa, I call him my professor. He taught me a lot about the politics and the history of the area, and is a superb trauma surgeon in San Joaquin Valley in California. He brought in way more than I did, $40,000 out of his own pocket, and his supplies were gone at the same time mine were. The vacuum of supplies that were already in the hospital prior to us getting there was impressive, such that what we brought, including the other team members who brought just as much as we did, if not more, it was gone. Yeah.
I mean, could you maybe say how that, if at all, ties in with how hospitals were functioning, or the capacity of hospitals as you saw it when you first got there? And did it change for better at any point? Or
Never
did it just
got better, only got worse. We became the only functional hospital in the region. We received, maybe our first week there, we noted that we were receiving transfers from every place else because of the lack of their supplies. A CAT scan machine was down. Their laboratory was hurt. And so we were receiving transfers of very sick people from other hospitals. Now, this is a hospital the size of European Gaza hospital. It's the size of any small community hospital, right? 200-bed hospital. There were 20,000 people living on the hospital grounds, most of which were sick and ill. The hospital itself had thousands of people living within the walls of the hospital. It had 4 areas called Medines that were nothing but filled with hospitals. 100 beds in each one. There was 400 or 500 people infirmed in these beds, all with open wounds, all with fractures, all with needing further surgeries, all getting wound care, all needing wound care, few of them getting it. So the hospital system was impressively stressed.
And how would you describe, I mean, you sort of alluded to it right now, how would you describe the condition of most of the patients that you were working with?
Dying or about to die, right? It's horrible. The bombs would go off constantly all day long. I was there during Ramadan, the meal at the end of Ramadan, iftar. Right before iftar, the drones would be more audible. Clearly visualizing where people were congregating, and the bombs would concentrate in those areas. The effectiveness of a non-discriminate 2,000-pound American bomb on a collection of women and children is much more impactful if you know where the people are collecting. And if 10 minutes after the bomb would go off in the distance, the few ambulances that were still operational and many, many cars and even donkey-pulled and horse-pulled carts would start showing up with injured people. And often in a room smaller than the space that we're sitting in, enough to hold 4 classic hospital gurneys. 4 gurneys would show up, and on each gurney was 3 to 5 kids, almost exclusively kids. 90% of our new admissions were kids, and there'd be 15, 20 kids coming in at the end of every bombing. A third were dead by the time they got to us. And a third would die in front of us. And a third we'd take to the operating room. And most of them would die.
I mean, you shared already in a previous interview how you were able to ascertain that these children were targeted by snipers.
Yes.
I'm wondering if you can tell us how often that would happen.
Every day.
On a daily basis.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes.
There's not a doc that's been there that probably can't testify that they didn't see kids shot in the head. I myself saw two children that were not shot just in the head, but in the chest first. Bullet holes exactly where I would put a stethoscope. And a second bullet hole directly in the side of a temple. One father, whose photograph of is I look at every night, explained to me how his kid was ripped out of his hand. And he went looking for him on the ground and couldn't find him. 10 meters away, he found his kid and looked at him while he got shot the second time. But his father thought that was the first time. When he came to us, he had no organs. When I rolled him over, he had no organs. A classic high-velocity bullet wound is a small entrance hole the size of the bullet, and the exit wall wound is capacious. An American football was the size of the hole in the kid's back. Everything between his shoulder blades and every organ in his chest was missing, including his spine. When I rolled him over, my hand fell into his chest, feeling his rib cage, and then when I rolled him back, the dressing fell off his head, and I saw his brains coming out of the other side. This kid was 6 years old. Next to him was another kid at the same time, who likewise had a hole directly in the center of his chest, went right in front of his ear and came out of his neck. And no kid, and I've said this on many outlets, but it's the truth and it stands. No kid gets shot twice by mistake by a sniper. It doesn't happen by mistake. They were deliberately targeted. And that's not beyond a war crime. That's targeted assassinations and it helps me formulate my opinion of what's really occurring in Gaza.
I mean, that's why I started off the interview saying whether we could, or hoping that we could talk about what it was like actually coming back, because having witnessed this unspeakable cruelty,
right,
and then coming to the U.S., and then shortly after, in the summer, you see Benjamin Netanyahu in Congress speaking,
right,
to the applause of many.
Right.
What was that like for you?
Well, let's address the applause of many first. That is strictly the fault of American laws that allow the AIPAC and the very strong evangelical Southern Christian groups to donate untold hundreds of millions of dollars to our politicians, which are just whores for the money, right? We don't have term limits here, so they can run again and again and again, and their job security is how many votes they can garnish, and the level of support they get from this money that promotes a Zionistic attitude. And your readership has to understand, and viewership has to understand, that my anti-Zionistic approach is not anti-Judaism. Most of my living family, including my beloved twin sister, are conservative Jews. But Zionism is not Judaism, right? And Zionism, and we can talk about this if you wish, is the biggest threat to Judaism in the world, right? But it is my hatred of Zionism that makes me hate Benjamin Netanyahu, right? He's a liar. I've said that in writing, I've said it verbally, and I've even invited him to sue me in an American court so that the truth can come out. When he says that children are not being targeted, that's a blatant lie. Indeed, I believe that they are the specific target of the Israeli war. I do not believe that Hamas is the target and that the innocent Palestinian is a bystander. What I believe instead of what's happening is that Hamas is the excuse, and that the Palestinian innocent bystander is indeed the intended target of the genocide that's actually taking place. And Hamas is just the excuse. The same way that Hezbollah is just the excuse for bombing Lebanon conveniently before the American election.
This is actually a perfect segue, because I want to ask you about that. I mean, do you see these, I'll reframe that. So that's perfect segue to what I want to actually ask you next about the elections. Do you see any of the candidates as being promising at all in terms of there being a ceasefire, justice for Palestine?
Well, Jill Stein has the best platform for a ceasefire and for supporting the lives of Palestinians, but she's not electable, right? She's never garnered, to my knowledge, more than 1% of the vote, which means the vote, in my opinion, for Jill Stein, as much as I would like for her to be more competitive in the race, a vote for her is really a vote for Trump, who is the nightmare for the Middle East. And so although I have issues with Kamala Harris, she's getting my vote because that's the best chance that we have to save the lives of Palestinians. Even if she stops the dropping of one bomb, that's probably 200 people that will live, right? And 80% of those will be babies.
Yes, yes. About the medical establishment, I mentioned it earlier, the American medical establishment specifically. I'm wondering what your thoughts are in terms of collectively the extent to which it's gone to provide. Yeah.
The medical establishment is quite maturely on the side of Israel because of donated monies. Even my own medical school at Thomas Jefferson receives hundreds of millions of dollars of donation from Jewish interests, under the pretense that to be anti-Zionistic again is to be anti-Semitic. And so a perfect example would be with my personal experience. When we were in Gaza, we've identified many medical students that were going to be student leaders because they found this one of the few remaining hospitals from very far away. These medical students would come into the hospital to volunteer, often leaving their families behind so that they can play doctor and help the injured, right? So they declared themselves as student leaders in the medical field in Gaza, right? That we started medical school classes when we were there, right? And they continued until the last person left, which was Adam Hamawe, another hero of mine. And these classes, we thought we would continue by trying to seek placement for these medical students in the United States, Canada, Mexico, and the Caribbean. We sent emails to the deans of admission to 200 medical schools, 205, I believe it was. 5 said yes, that they would consider it. 5. One of them only if they took 2 Jewish students as well, right? Not that they all were paying attention to the politics. They didn't want to be perceived as pro-Palestinian. Everyone asked for us to do it on the QT. Don't make it public. We want to help you, but we can't. UNC, I live in the shadow of UNC and Duke, Wake Med, the research triangle, the corners of the triangle, all 3 wouldn't even consider it.
I mean, in a way, I ask in significant part, not just because it's the medical establishment and it's an influential community, but also just for the simple fact that as a doctor, of course, there's the oath, or what's often referred to as the Hippocratic Oath,
Sure,
doing no harm. So conceivably, you would think that this community or this establishment would be outraged by what's happening more than anyone, right?
And it depends on how you define doing no harm. If doing no harm means that you can close your eyes to global trauma, then they can feel comfortable with their Hippocratic Oath. But it doesn't in reality, right? When your taxpayer dollars as a physician are buying 2,000-pound bombs that are meant to go through 20 feet of hardened concrete and granite and sandstone to blow up an Afghani hidden bunker in a mountain, and it's being dropped on a tent city with nothing but women and children and old people in it, right? And then you see images of it because everybody has access to the images if they really want them, right? Or they hear about them at least. What do they think their taxpayers are really doing? Are they really killing a selective single Hamas operative and not killing a bunch of, quote, innocent bystanders by the tens of thousands, the number 40,000 is bullshit. There's hundreds of thousands of people in the rubble alone. Hundreds of thousands. We all know the statistics in Turkey when there was an earthquake. It starts off with, 300 people believed dead. What was the final number? It grew exponentially every single day, right? When this rubble, and as it did in Haiti, there was 180 people believed to be dead in Haiti. First broadcast went over 200,000, right? When they start excavating the rubble, if they ever do, the hundreds of millions of tons of concrete, because all the buildings were rebar and concrete, they're going to find hundreds of thousands of skeletons.
Well, there's so many that we know are unaccounted for right now.
The Lancet article already raised their 40,000 of accounted deaths to 118,000, right? So it's going to be twice that, minimum twice that. And that's just deaths. That's not the morbidity. That's not the injuries. That's not the people who have psychiatric issues because of this. That's not do you think post-traumatic stress is alive and well and living in Gaza? And every kid, those that lived are missing body parts. How do they function, right? Every person who had surgery guaranteed has an infection because we couldn't eradicate infection. Polio is a highly communicable disease. The sewage plants were destroyed by Israel. The electricity was shut off that powered them. Polio thrives in a sewage-filled environment. It's rainy season right now in Gaza. The sewage levels are rising. Polio is going to explode, and it will grow exponentially. And without a ceasefire, you can't vaccinate the presumed 800,000 children under 10. It's way more than 2 million, right? 50% of the population. That's an Israeli number, 800,000. The World Health Organization says it's millions and millions of kids. And think about it, the population is 50% children. There's 200 million people still living. It's 100 million children that need to be vaccinated.
Yes. Those that do survive, or that you saw survive, say from an explosion, like what are the chances that they will continue to survive in the absence of the healthcare and the resources?
Very little. We have no way of tracking the long-term healthcare of these people. An example, a nurse was shot in the operating room. His knee was blown across the room. And this is a story of tragedy which amplifies the war crimes committed by the IDF, but it also is pursuant to the point that we're making now about long-term health care. So this is a tax-paying, productive, highly skilled member of the Gazan society, helping other Gazans who are injured. He's closing a wound in the operating room. During that closure, an Israeli soldier, I believe it was the Kuwaiti hospital, but I could be wrong, and it is an IDF soldier comes in and orders him to leave the patient who's still asleep on the table. He refuses to. The nurse gets his knee shot and his tibia bone, the bone right below the knee, the bottom half of the knee, gets blown across the operating room. He's missing this much of his shin bone by the knee. He gets operated on that day himself to save his life and to save his leg. They fill the defect with medical plastic, cement. His wounds can't be closed because he's missing a bunch of skin. He's admitted to the hospital, of course. The next day, the Israeli soldiers come and arrest him. They take him to Israel in a prison, blindfolded and handcuffed. He remained blindfolded and handcuffed for 45 days, fed a juice box every day, sometimes every other day, no solid food, zero wound care, with a gaping open wound. He then gets dropped off at the border naked on the 45th day because they do their investigation, I suspect, but clearly he's not Hamas because they never would have let him go, right? So he crawls for 3 kilometers, blinded in one eye because as a going away present, he gets a rifle butt in his right eye. It explodes in his head, right? His eye liquids are dripping down his face. He crawls in the dirt. Somebody finds him naked, brings him to our hospital. So a perfect example of starvation, torture, inappropriate arrest and detainment, denial of medical care, which is against our country's Leahy Act, right? All those high war crimes in just one person. And today I communicate with him almost every day. He's in Egypt, and he told me yesterday they want to amputate his leg. Well, that'll above the knee, which will take him out of the operating room, which means the societal investment into this guy to help hundreds of thousands of people in his lifetime is wasted. The morbidity that was cast upon this man, the pain that, let alone the pain and the torture inflicted, but the loss to society of people who are now not taxpayers but tax consumers in a country that will never collect taxes again for a millennia, is devastating to the infrastructure of a society, which again is the goal of the autocracy of Israel, that my country and my taxpayers are supporting, quite illicitly and quite illegally.
I just feel there's so much that you've illuminated, but so much that's troubling, so much that just...
All we have to do is follow our own laws, and the war in Lebanon would have never started. The wars in the Gaza would have stopped within weeks of it starting. 1980-ish, Ronald Reagan makes a call to Menachem Begin as he's bombing Beirut, just like we're doing now, and says, stop the bombing or I'll withhold my support. Within 20 minutes, the bombing in Beirut stops and never restarts. Biden can do the same thing. I voted for Biden because the alternative was worse. One telephone call can stop all wars. Israel cannot thrive without American taxpayer paid for bombs. That's all it would take. England is stopping their supply of bombs to Israel. Germany has not stopped. They still have this lingering guilt for killing Jews in World War II. But Germany will stop if America does.
I mean, to that point, whether it's withholding funding for military supplies or what have you, do you have any final thoughts or observations that you might want to share, notwithstanding, as I was just saying a moment ago, how troubling I feel this discussion is, if I'm to be totally candid? Is there perhaps any hopeful words that are not naive, but...
Sure.
Yes.
Two things. Yes. One, the American public and the Western public really needs to understand the difference between Zionism and Judaism, right? Israel is deliberately making them synonyms of each other, and they are highly not synonyms. Zionism was invented in the mid-1890s, 50 years before Israel became even a country. Yet today, it's evolved into a justification for the right-wing Israeli government to occupy Palestinian lands. It's simply a way of grabbing and taking over their land. That's all it is. It's not supporting Judaism. It's not designed to protect the life and livelihood of the Jew like it was written for in the 1890s. What it's designed to do is to justify the acquisition of unarmed Palestinian lands. Granted, what Hamas did on October 7th was horrible. No person, none of the doctors who I went with, I don't know the person who could justify that. That's a horrible event. But if people would study what Gaza was like on October 6th, they'll realize that it was nothing but an open-air prison, and it remains so today, under the complete control of Israel, who controlled their imports and exports, the electromagnetic space, which is their telephone, TV, internet. They controlled the waterway, in the Mediterranean. If you were a Gazan in the last 10 years and you went 100 yards out into the ocean, you got shot by a gunboat. So they can't even fish in their own waters, territorial waters, as recognized by the UN. Now, Israel sold the gas and oil rights off of Gazan territory to BP and Shell, right? but the Gazans will never realize the profit from that, right? America needs to know that their tax dollars are supporting a political ideology and not a religion, that it is okay to be pro-Jewish and anti-Israeli. Indeed, the most dangerous place for a Jew to be in the world is in Israel, right? And us supporting Zionistic attitudes through the propaganda of the AIPAC and the monetary support of ultra-right-wing evangelicals in the United States, which actually donate more money than the AIPAC to our governors and legislatures. Had it not been for that political support, Israel would not have the funding or the legal support from the United States to continue with the genocide that they're doing right now.
Yes. Thank you so much, Clark. I'm very grateful for this discussion. Of course, I wish you all the very best with your courageous work.
Thank you.